Hi, everybody. We are really our pleasure to have Professor Nolan come out all the way from across the country just to give us a talk on the legacy of Nagasaki, which includes the Christians in Japan, also the Nagasaki bomb, and some other I'm getting tongue-tied up here. Sorry. So he's gonna give us a talk, and it's gonna be really, really interesting. Father, did you want to give a blessing before we get started, or no? No. Okay, we're fine. Okay, so let's go ahead and give a warm Maryknoll welcome to Professor Nolan. Thank you.
Thank you. There we go. Ohayou gozaimasu. Hajimemashite, Nolan desu. Watashi wa sashin Los Angeles no Palos Verdes desu. Oh, you can't hear it. Okay. How's that? Is that better? Okay. You weren't missing anything, I promise. Yeah. I was only going to say Nihongo. Watashi wa Nihongo chotto hanashimasu. Nihongo benkyou shimasu. Nihongo musokashi. So, kyo. Eigo hanashimasu. So, all right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm grateful to be here to talk to you about the Nagasaki Bell Project. First, let me just tell you how I got into this. In 2020, I wrote a book called Atomic Doctors. You see it up there. And this is about the doctors who were on the Manhattan Project. And my grandfather was an OBGYN with training in radiology. And he was recruited very early on in the process in 1943 by Robert Oppenheimer to serve as the post surgeon in Los Alamos. So he had a number of very interesting roles in the dawn of the nuclear age, and this book traces his journey along with the other doctors who were on the Manhattan Project. And that journey included going into Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I'll just do it this way. So this is a picture that was taken in early September 1945. That's my grandfather on the right, and this is on one of the makeshift hospitals in the outskirts of Hiroshima. So this is like September 9th or 10th, very early on, about a month after the bombs were dropped. And he was part of what's called the Joint Commission. It was a commission of both Japanese and American doctors assessing the damage from the bomb. So both the physical, structural damage, as well as the damage that was done to the hibakusha, to the victims of the bomb. So that you see him here with Masao Tsuki, who's the leader of the Japanese part of the Joint Commission, observing a hibakusha. This is an Army doctor, John Flick, who was an ophthalmologist examining the eyes. So, again, there's much more to this story, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just telling you that's how I got into this. So in following my grandfather's journey, I went to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when I went to Nagasaki, I learned about the story of the Nagasaki Catholics, the hidden Christians, and one of the leaders of their group, a radiologist named Takashi Nagai. So what I'm going to talk about today is that. Takashi Nagai, as some of you know, was a Japanese radiologist who taught at Nagasaki University Medical School and practiced at its hospital. Now, the story of Nagai is an amazing one. He grew up with Shinto, Buddhist, and Confucius influences in his life, but over time he became an atheist and a self-described scientific materialist. So that was his kind of orientation. However, over time, this began to soften, and it softened first off in that he took an interest in the readings of Pascal, or the writings of Pascal. So he began to read Pascal, and this began to kind of soften the hard atheism that he had embraced. And another thing that began to soften it was that while he was in medical school, this was in 1931, he took a room with a family in Nagasaki, the Moriyama family, while he was in medical school. The Moriyama family lived right near the Catholic Cathedral, and they were themselves descendants of the hidden Christians in Japan, or the Kokuri Christian. And in living with them, he began to learn about the history of the suffering and the persecution of the hidden Christians that had been taking place not just decades, but centuries. So a little bit about that. A little bit about the history. But first of all, I should say that Nagai was also very much drawn or enticed by the faith because of this family, because of the community, and because of the cathedral and the bells. The Angelus bells rang out 3 times a day. And one of his first biographers, who was actually a friend of his, Yakichi Kataoka, he says this in his biography about Nagai. He said, "Behind the university, across a little stream, on a hill facing the university grounds, towered the Urakami Cathedral. Nagai's eyes were drawn to the red bricks of this cathedral, and his ears bent toward the Angelus bells. The yearning Nagai felt toward these bells would not fade even until his dying day." So even the bells of Nagasaki, the bells of the Urakami Cathedral, was part of what kind of drew him gradually to the Catholic faith. When he was living with the Moriyama family, he learned all about the history of Christianity in Japan, which starts with your patron saint, Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier landed in Kagoshima on Kyushu Island on August 15th, 1549, and thus began a very fruitful missionary effort in Japan. By 1579, there were about 100,000 converts in Japan. And from early on, Nagasaki was a central place where the Christians lived. Nagasaki basically grew up as a Christian town. In fact, between 1580 and 1587, Nagasaki was a Jesuit territory, a very unusual arrangement. The Jesuits actually had Nagasaki as a territory. One of the feudal lords or daimyos at the time, Omura Sumatada, is the one who gave Nagasaki to the Jesuits. Now, about this time, this is by the beginning of the 17th century, as Nagasaki is growing as a Christian town, there are, by this time, about 300,000 converts. So Christianity continued to grow, continued to expand. However, after about 40 years of successful missionary work, the daimyo, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, who was the most powerful daimyo in Japan at the time, one of the great unifiers, as he's called, he issued an edict expelling Christian missionaries. So this was in 1587, thus ended the Jesuits' control of Nagasaki. Though the edict was only partially enforced, the persecution of Christians in Japan intensified over the next several decades. In 1597, 26 Catholics were arrested and marched from Kyoto to Nagasaki. The journey took 30 days and covered 450 miles. It was a torturous journey. And the reason that Hideyoshi Toyotomi wanted to send them to Nagasaki was precisely because it was a strong Christian center. And the idea would be to deter the Christians by seeing this execution of the Catholics. So again, the reason Nagasaki was chosen was precisely because it was a center of strong Christian belief. So once they got to Nagasaki, they were put on crosses on Nishizaka Hill, and they were crucified. Now, Nishizaka Hill, I should point out, is about 1.5 miles, just over 1.5 miles from the epicenter of the bomb. One of the Jesuits, Brother Paul Mickey, was on track to become the first Japanese ordained priest. And just before he was killed, he cried out, giving a short sermon of encouragement to those Christians watching the execution. And then he gave, he said he forgave Hideyoshi Toyotomi and the others who were responsible for his execution. And then he gave his farewell song, "Lord, into my hands I commend my spirit. Into your hands I commend my spirit." The restrictions on Christianity continued to intensify. In 1614, Christianity was banned throughout the entire country. How many of you have you seen this wonderful miniseries, Shogun? Has anyone seen that? A few of you, yeah. So in Shogun, the Shogun, right? There's a fictionalized version of Ieyasu Tokugawa, who was the first shogun of the Tokugawa era, and he's featured in that. And he's the one that issued that edict in 1614. Thereafter, the Japanese Christians were forced to go underground, and remarkably, these Kakuri Krishitan, hidden Christians, carried on the faith for 2.5 centuries, without priests, without public services, without most of the sacraments central to the Christian faith, to the Catholic faith. And a large group of them moved to Urakami. Now, Urakami at the time was a separate village. Now it's a suburb of Nagasaki, but it was a separate village north of Nagasaki. And this was part of what happened when the Christians went into hiding. They went into these kind of liminal spaces, right? They were not so central. And this is what happened. Urakami was one of the places where the Christians went. In these years of hiding, the persecution of Christians in Japan was intense. If discovered, Christians were imprisoned, brutally tortured, and sometimes killed. Great pressure was put on them to apostatize. And toward this end, the Japanese guards would make the Christians step on the fumie. Here's an image of the fumie, which was an image of Christ or Mary on a piece of wood or bronze. And it was a way to ferret out the hidden Christians. But also, I should point out, and this goes against, if any of you have seen Martin Scorsese's Silence, or it's based on a book by Shusaku Endo, same title. What happened in Urakami was a bit different. First of all, they never made stepping on the fumie an act of courage or heroism. And in fact, they saw it as a torture to step on the fumie. And they would go through a kind of confession afterwards, and they felt terrible. They agonized over having done this. They also had statues. And this is what they called the Maria Canon. So it looks like the Buddhist deity Canon, but the Catholics saw this as Mary holding the Christ child. And so if the authorities came in, they would see this, and they wouldn't be suspect, and they could be in hiding. And if you in Kyushu, all over in museums, there are these Maria Canons, and if you turn them around, often there's a cross etched in the back. So it's a way for them to kind of maintain the faith while having the guise of being Buddhist observers. So the Japanese Christians were forced underground. They carried on secretly for 2.5 centuries. This is the most amazing thing. Eventually, because of international pressure, Japan was made to open up to the West, and missionaries returned. In 1864, a French priest completed a church in Owura. There it is. This is the Owura Church. This is in the southern part of Nagasaki. This is what it looks like today. It was at the time in what was called the foreign concession, or the foreign section of the town. That is, when Nagasaki and other port towns opened up, they had these foreign concessions where only foreigners could live. and so Christianity was still illegal for the Japanese. Only foreigners were allowed to go to this church. Nevertheless, the Urakami Catholics heard about this church, and they became curious. So they wanted to investigate. And this took a lot of courage for them to do this. So there had been a prophecy issued in the 17th century by a Japanese helper, or the term is dojuku. It's kind of like a deacon, and his name was Bastian, or Sebastian. And before he himself was executed, he offered a prophecy, and his prophecy was, the missionaries will come back, and they will come back in 7 generations. And you will know that they are the authentic Catholic priests if there are 3 authenticating criteria. 1, the priest would be celibate. 2, they would venerate Mary. And 3, they would be in communion with Papa Sama, with the Pope in Rome, right? They would be in communion with Rome. So Bastian said, they'll come back in 7 generations, and you'll know it's the real deal if there are these 3 criteria. So the Urakami Catholics wanted to go figure this out. So they went down to the Owura Church that you see here, and this was in 1865, and they had to kind of sneak into the church, and they did so. And at the front of the church, there was a French missionary named Father Bernard Pettigin, and he was praying. And they came up to Father Pettigin, and they engaged with him, and they said, show us a statue of Mary. We want to make sure you're the real thing. And he's confused, he's trying to understand what they're saying, and then one of them says, our hearts and your heart are the same. Please show us a statue of Mary. So he takes them over to the side chapel and shows them this statue. And this statue is still there today. You can go see it. And it's unbelievably moving to sit there and pray before this statue. And one of the things I love about it is the Christ child with his arms wide open. It's like, welcome home, you know. So this is regarded as a very monumental event in the history of Christianity in Japan. It's referred to as the discovery of the hidden Christians. Incidentally, the Urakami Catholics did this during Lent, what they called the sad season. That's when they went to the Ora church. If you look outside the church, there's this relief. And this relief shows Father Pettigen, and then this is that statue of Mary, and these are the Urakami Catholics. It was led by a group of women to go and speak and investigate. Okay, and so I've been to Nagasaki 3 times. I lived there for a semester and interviewed all sorts of people. And in the fall of 2022, I interviewed this man, Murasu Matsuo. And he is a direct descendant of one of the women who approached Father Pettigen back in 1865. His great-great-grandmother is Teru Moriuchi. And according to their family, she's the one that said, show us a statue of Mary. And the point I really want to make here is that this history, this remarkable history, still informs the faith of the people today. So you have here Matsuo, and then you have his son, and then you have his granddaughter, and his granddaughter here is pointing to Teru Moriuchi. So this is 7 generations removed, and she's pointing to her great-great-great-grandmother. And I think that this picture illustrates the way in which the courage of their ancestors, they still remember, and it still informs the faith today. Anyway, after this encounter, Teru Moriuchi and the others informed the priests of the hidden communities and the secret places where they held their private hidden services. So Pettigen then, of course, Pettigen was thrilled to have discovered these hidden Christians who can trace their faith back to Francis Xavier and the early missionaries. And he would go out at night, and he'd dress as a farmer, and he would meet with them in the various places that they met, including Urakami, and say masses. And these are the first masses they had in over 200 years. And it was a remarkable encounter. Soon they learned that there were other communities in places like Sotome and the Goto Islands, Harado, and the Pettigen and the other French priests would then go to these other communities and minister to the Christians. It was estimated there were about 50,000 hidden Christians still practicing the faith, most of them in Kyushu, the southernmost of the 4 main Japanese islands. Well, this contact with the Catholics emboldened them. Bastian's prophecy had been fulfilled. They re-engaged with the missionaries, and so they therefore became less discreet and less hidden. They became bolder in their faith. And as a consequence, the authorities had to crack down because it was still illegal. I mean, there was the foreign concession, but that was for foreigners. It was still illegal to be a Christian for the Japanese. So what happens is another persecution, another major persecution, what they in Urakami referred to as the Yonban Kazuri, the 4th persecution. And it took place between 1867 and 1873. And what happened is they exiled the Urakami Catholics to 22 different regions throughout Japan. They wanted to get them away from the missionaries and away from each other. And so they exiled them. About 3,400 Urakami Catholics were exiled. 664 of them died during the exile, and only about 1,900 finally returned in 1873 after the Japanese government finally loosened its enforcement of the Christian prohibition policy that had lasted for more than 250 years. Well, one of the locations that they were exiled was a place called Tsuwano. And Tesuano is actually on Honshu Island, east of Hiroshima, and it's up in the hills, and a number of the Urakami Catholics were exiled to Tesuano. And my wife and I went and visited it when we lived there, and as we approached the place, it's just west of the beautiful town of Tesuano. It's a lovely kind of traditional Japanese village, and just to the east of it is where the Christians were held and where they were tortured and persecuted. And as we walked up, a mass is going on. It was remarkable. It was just at the beginning of it. So what I love about this picture is that you have literally a contemporary mass with the backdrop of this history of persecution and suffering right behind them. So you have this mass, and then you can see there's an image of Mary, and then there's an image of a man in a basically 1 meter by 1 meter cage. And this was one of the forms of torture, is they would leave them in these cages, and for days, basically naked. And this particular person who's represented there, even though there were a number who had to go through this torture, is a man named Yasutaro Mori. And Yasutaro Mori would be out there, and some of the other prisoners got concerned about him because it was very cold. The Nagasaki climate, as some of you may know, is quite warm, and this is up in the hills, so it got very cold at night. And they got concerned about him. So one of the leaders of the group, a guy named Jinzaburo Moriyama, actually digs a hole, removes one of the planks of the prison floor, digs a hole out, and he's going to go visit him at night, sneak out to go visit with him. So he does so, and he goes and he visits with Yasutaro Mori, and he says, "We're concerned about you. It must be very cold. How are you doing? We're worried about you." And Yasutaro Mori said, "Yes, it is cold and it's difficult, but around midnight every night, a woman with a blue veil comes and visits me and tells me stories until the sun comes up. So I'm doing okay." And he goes, and he said, "Don't tell anybody about this until after I die." And Jinzaburo honored that request, but he died about 3 days later, and then Jinzaburo Moriyama told the rest of the community about this. So this is the story of the Yonban Kazuri and the torture and the persecution at Tesuano is remarkable. And this is a relief that's right up at the same site. And each of these individuals I could tell you stories about, and they're incredible. They're just incredible stories. And just to give you a couple examples, this right here is Mori Iwanaga, 5 years old. She was the daughter of the last baptizer. They had these roles, the hidden Christians, and one was to be the misukata, the water person, the baptizer. And they separated her, the authorities separated her from her parents, and they showed her candy. And they said, "If you just renounce the faith of your parents, we'll give you this candy." And she looked at them and shook her head, and she said, "They have better things than that in heaven." And she said no. And she's one of the ones that died there in Tesuano. Amazing. And then these are the two of the leaders. This is Jinzaburo Moriyama. He's the one that dug the hole out. This is Senamon Takagi. And right here, if you can see her face right there, that's Teru Moriuchi. She was the one who the little girl's pointing to. She was one of the ones that approached Pedagin back in 1865. She was exiled to Tesuano, and she survived. All three of those people survived and went back. Again, the stories here are amazing. The courage, the heroism, the faith, the resolve. It was really remarkable. Well, when I was back in Nagasaki in May of 2023, they held a number of events celebrating the 150th anniversary of the return from the Yonban Kazuri. And they euphemistically refer to it as the journey. I just love that, the journey. And anyway, so they were celebrating it. And when they came back from these places, they would often do the last part of it on a boat and go up through the Nagasaki harbor, and then they would walk from the harbor back up to Urakami. So they reenacted that walk, and here you see them doing that. So again, this is just in 2023. They're walking from the harbor back up to the now rebuilt Urakami Catholic Cathedral. And inside they had a mass, a commemorative mass, and if you see those banners, these are 22 banners that represent the 22 places that they were exiled. And you had, in this case, often actual descendants of those who went to those places. And again, my main point here is this history of suffering and persecution and endurance is very, very present. It very much informs the faith of the people today. And it was certainly the case with Takashi Nagai. He learned about this. He knew about this history. Now, I should point out that when they came back in 1873, one of the reasons that the Yonban-Kazuri finally ended was because of pressure from the United States. So there was the famous Iwakura embassy. When Japan was opening up, they sent these leaders to the United States and to Europe to learn about modern democracy and industrialization and so forth. And they actually met in the White House with Ulysses S. Grant, and he made explicit reference to the importance of religious freedom. And if you look at a redacted version of his words, he actually made explicit reference to the Urakami Catholics. So that was our concern. Now, the great irony is, that was in 1873. We put pressure on the Japanese authorities to exercise more religious freedom toward the Christians in Japan. They came home. They finally have freedom. They build a cathedral, and we dropped a bomb on it. So it's this painful irony that the Japanese Catholics are very much aware of and talk about. Well, all this history is conveyed to Nagai as he lived with the Moriyama family, shared meals with them. Nagai eventually met with a priest at the cathedral. This is the beautiful cathedral that they built. And at the cathedral, he, again, just to give you a little bit of history on this, they were freed in 1873. They could go back. They start building the cathedral in 1895, and they completed it in 1914. So it was just about 30 years later that this cathedral was destroyed by the atom bomb. Nagai, again, he was kind of drawn to the faith by this community, by the bells in the cathedral, and he goes to the cathedral and he meets with a priest. He eventually, let me go. He meets with a priest, and the priest that he meets with is this one, Father Moriyama. Now, Father Moriyama is the son of Jinzaburo Moriyama, the person I talked about, the one who dug out of the prison, the one who was one of the leaders of the group, who was tortured mercilessly when he was there. And this is his sister, and she was also in Toswano. They all survived. And this is the priest, his son, who Nagai first met with when he went to the cathedral. He eventually becomes Catholic against the strong opposition of his family, and he would later marry Midori Moriyama, who was the daughter of the family that he lived with. He took as his confirmation name Paul Mickey. So again, even that, there's a reference to this kind of history of persecution among the Catholic community. So after he marries, after a time, he completes medical school. He becomes a doctor and a radiologist in Nagasaki. In the summer of 1945, Nagai was now head of the radiology department at Nagasaki Hospital, and he was the dean of radiology at the medical school. He and Midori had two young children, a boy and a girl, and after the Hiroshima bombing on August 6, 1945, they heard about it and they sent their kids to live with relatives in the country, but Midori and Takashi stayed in Nagasaki. So then on August 9th, the bomb was dropped at 11:02 a.m., about a mile and a half off its target, and it exploded only about 650 yards from the Catholic Cathedral in Urakami. At the time, 2 Japanese priests and 24 parishioners were waiting to hear confession in anticipation of August 15th, the feast day of the Assumption of Mary. So all of those parishioners and those 2 priests, as well as 8,500 Catholics out of a population of about 12,000, died immediately from the bomb, including Midori Nagai. So Nagai, she was at their home. He was up at the medical school, and he watched from the medical school as the cathedral went up in flames. And these are images of the destroyed cathedral that actually I inherited in my grandfather's papers when I was working on the atomic doctors project. So here are a couple images. of the cathedral that was destroyed after the bomb. So these were taken early on, September of 1945. The hospital was about 550 yards from the epicenter of the explosion. When the blast came, the guy was thrown about 10 feet across the room in the radiology wing of the hospital. Because of the location of the radiology wing, a number of the staff there survived, where about 80% of the patients and doctors in the hospital were killed by the bomb. But because of the location, Nagai and some of the others survived. And they set to work caring for the victims of the bomb immediately. And eventually, Nagai made his way home and found only the charred remains, bones of his wife Midori. But in her hands, he found this, the melted remains of her rosary that were near the bones of her hands. So presumably she was holding her rosary beads at the time of the bombing. It's beyond horrifying to read about all that Nagai saw in the aftermath of the bomb, which he wrote about. He himself was severely injured. Not only did he receive the injury on his head, his right temple was severed and bled, artery was cut through, but he also received a great deal of radiation exposure. He had already received a great deal of radiation exposure in his roles as a radiologist, and he didn't use very much protection at all. And so he'd already been diagnosed with leukemia even before the bomb, but he got more radiation exposure. Nevertheless, in spite of these injuries, even with his injuries, he carried on trying to help others. He and a group of others set up a relief mission in Mitsuyama, which is about 3 miles from the epicenter of the bomb, where they worked and cared for the victims of the bomb. So he gave of himself in the service of others. Eventually, he carried on like this for several weeks, but his health began to deteriorate. And a month after the bomb, the opening in his head began bleeding. You can see him there on the bottom right with the bandage around his head. It opened up. He was showing signs of severe A-bomb sickness. He had a temperature of 104 that lasted for over a week. He went in and out of a coma. 3 doctors said he was dying. A priest came and gave him his last rites. Now, as this is happening, his mother-in-law, Midori's mother, went up to the Lourdes Grotto at the nearby Hongochi Monastery. There it is. Now, the Hongochi Monastery was south and also kind of behind a mountain, so it also was spared from the bomb. The monastery with its grotto was built by this man, Maximilian Kolbe. Do you know who he is? He's a famous Polish saint, and he and Nagai knew each other. Kolbe lived in Nagasaki from 1930 to 1936. He started the Hongochi Monastery, and I should tell you that it's still there. It's still thriving. It's all Japanese friars now. In fact, Nagai even x-rayed him at one point because Kolbe had tuberculosis. Anyway, Midori's mother puts the Lourdes Grotto water on Nagai's lips. Nagai, not even knowing that at this point Kolbe's already dead, having given his life for a married man at Auschwitz, he had given his life. He prays to Kolbe, and he's immediately healed. So the injury on the right side of his head goes away, and he's kind of restored to strength, and he amazingly carries on for another 5+ years, caring for his community, for his 2 children, in ways that are simply remarkable. Because of his deteriorating condition, eventually is bedridden, but even as he's bedridden, he carries on. He paints. He wrote over a dozen books, the most famous of which is The Bells of Nagasaki, which was made into a movie. There are a couple songs called The Bells of Nagasaki. It became a bestseller, and he gave the proceeds from the book to rebuilding the church, the community, and he also painted and wrote poetry. So he did everything he could. In the first months after the bomb, he eventually returned to the site of his home, and they had the community built him a little house. And here's an image of that house. It's still there. It's a place that people like to visit. And he gave it the name Nyakodo, which refers to love thy neighbor as thyself house. And in the house, he carried on doing what he could do. This is an image of him now bedridden, his 2 kids. You see he was getting all sorts of correspondence, and he wrote and painted, and he suffered a great deal, yet you see there he's smiling, and you often see pictures of Nagai smiling. So in spite of his suffering, he was a very joyful person. In fact, if any of you read A Song for Nagasaki by Paul Glim actually compares him to Philip Neri, who was also a joyful, happy saint. Anyway, after the bomb, with the ruins all around them, what were they to do? What were the surviving Catholics to do? The cathedral was destroyed. Their world was destroyed. Many in their community, including Midori, had been killed. Well, it was decided that the Catholics have a requiem mass for the victims of the bomb, those who had died. And they asked Nagai to give the lay eulogy for that mass. And so Nagai, this is while he's still able to walk around, took this invitation very seriously and thought hard about what he was going to say. How were they to understand this? How were they to make sense of this incredible form of suffering that their community was enduring? And apparently he walked among the ruins and thought deeply about this. And here are a couple images of him. These are actually from American military film. I took a couple shots from it. You see him there with the staff. He still has the bandage. He's wearing black for mourning for Midori. And apparently he went up among the ruins and sat and thought about what he was going to say. So the eulogy itself took place on November 23rd, 1945, so a couple months after the bomb. And he gave a eulogy that is still discussed today. People still talk about it, what he said. And I want to highlight several things that he said in the eulogy. And here's an image of that mass. You see it was conducted right against the backdrop of the ruins of the cathedral. Well, first he spoke of the significance of August 15th and explained that it was on August 15th that Japan finally surrendered, 6 days after the Nagasaki bomb. He also noted that it was the Feast of the Assumption, significant because the cathedral bore a Marian name. It was the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. It should also be noted that it was August 15th, 1534, that a group of men, including Francis Xavier, took vows in Paris, which marked the beginning of the Jesuit order. 15 years later, also August 15th, 1549, Francis Xavier landed in Kagoshima and said the first Mass ever said in Japan. It was also on August 15th, 1871, that one of the very first churches in Nagasaki was built. And it was actually called the Church of the Assumption in commemoration and in recognition of Francis Xavier's landing. I should also point out that it was August 15th, 1939, that the letter signed by Albert Einstein was given to Alexander Sachs to take to Roosevelt, which initiated the Manhattan Project. So Nagai notes this important date. He also notes the significance of the Urakami Catholics' history and the deep connection between the destruction of Urakami and the end of the war. So he makes note of their history. He said that the Urakami Catholics who died had been a sacrifice of atonement for the sin of war. Urakami, he said, was chosen as a pure lamb, slaughtered and burned. He noted Nagasaki's long history of persecution and suffering. He said, our Urakami church had persisted for 400 years, shedding the blood of numerous martyrs as it protected the righteous faith. He referred to it as a great Holocaust, or Hansai is the Japanese word. And he urged his fellow mourners to regard it as something beautiful, something pure, and something sacred. He acknowledged the great loss to the city. He said Urakami is in complete ruins. As far as one can see, it is all ashes and tiles, no houses to live in, no clothes to wear. We stand aimlessly in the fire ruins. What were they to do? Well, he urged his fellow Catholics to look to, I quote, Christ, who shouldered the cross up the hill of Calvary. He will certainly grant us courage when we carry upon our shoulders the heavy burden of reparations, being ridiculed, mocked, whipped, soaked in sweat, covered in blood, and thirsty. In other words, by looking to the cross, they could find strength and find deep meaning in their sufferings. They were given the opportunity to share in Christ's sufferings. In this, they could rejoice. And so as he put it at the very end of the eulogy, he says, alas, let us always praise the work of the omniscient and omnipotent Lord. Let us give thanks for the Church of Urakami, having been chosen out of the entire world to be offered in the Holocaust. Hansai. And as I said, he did some painting And this is one of the images he painted. Now that's an image of his wife Midori with her rosary beads standing on top of the mushroom cloud of the bomb. Hansai, peace offering, Holocaust. That's how he imagined it. That's what he conveyed to his fellow Catholics. Well, you can imagine that not everyone took this so well. It was a difficult interpretation and a difficult narrative, and the reactions were mixed. But Nagai himself never backed off. He maintained this until the end of his life, and he would share it with others. And one of the people that he shared it with was a friend of his named Ichitaro Yamada. Now, Yamada had been a soldier in the war, and he was stationed at an island elsewhere. So he wasn't in Nagasaki at the time of the bombing. However, his wife, his 5 children, and his parents were, and they all died. They were all killed by the bomb. So he goes to Nagai, and he says, I'm angry. and Nagai empathized and understood his anger, and he said he experienced the sadness of the loss of Midori, but he suggested to Yamada-san that the only way open to anyone who believed the gospel was to see the A-bomb as part of God's providence, setsuri. It's a Japanese word, which he said always brings good from evil. Yamada became a good friend of Nagai's, and together they decided they would go up to the cathedral to see if they could dig up one of the bells. So if you remember from the images of the destroyed cathedral, one side, there were 2 towers, and the left side was completely blown off, and the bell was shattered. But on the right side, it was under a pile of rubble. It went down into the ground and under a pile of rubble. So they don't know the condition of that bell. So on December 24th, 1945, Yamada-san and Nagai, they gathered a group of others, and they go up to the ruins and begin digging to see if they can find this bell. It took all day. They finally cleared and found the top of it, dug around it, used a block and tackle to pull it up out of the ground, and amazingly, it was completely intact. There's an image of it. They put it on a tripod of logs, and they decided, we're going to see if we can make this ring, not knowing whether it would ring. And they did. So this is on Christmas Eve. They rang out the Angelus, and it worked. And it was because of Nagasaki was completely decimated, there was nothing blocking the sound, so it went out far and wide and was a sound of great hope to the surviving Catholics and other victims of the bomb. This is a picture of another one of my interlocutors, lovely man I interviewed several times. His name is Father Hitoshi Kataoka, and he's a retired Franciscan priest. And he was actually in the cathedral the morning of the bomb. And he'd gone there to go to confession, again, in preparation for August 15th, the Assumption of Mary. But he was with a group of older boys. And in line at the time were a group of younger kids. And they cut in line. And therefore, he was able to go to confession and get out and go home. And he lives on the east part of the city up a hill, and thus he survived, survived the bomb. Nevertheless, he barely did. He was inside his house, so he had some protection. He went outside of his house. He literally saw his brother burn to death from the bomb, and his grandmother was killed as well. In addition to that, he was actually playing in the rubble on December 24th with some friends, and he saw Yamada-san and Nagai and these others begin to dig up the bell. So he witnessed that whole thing. And he witnessed them ringing the bell. And in my interview with him, I asked him about that, and this is what he said, and these are his exact words. I'll read them to you. He said, "I remember very well when that bell was rung, and I remember it because at that time there were no cars, there was nothing, it was very, very quiet. And then the sound of the gong of the bell, that sound is still in my memory. It is still in my ears. I can still hear it from when I was a child, 75 years later, 76 years later, that sound. This was such a beautiful sound. There was nothing that stopped that sound from traveling. No houses, no trees, no natural sound, no nothing. Out in the fields and near the mountains, the sound itself rang. I have forgotten many things that I cannot forget." Well, the Urakami Catholics eventually rebuilt their cathedral in the same place where it stood before the bomb, which is itself the very spot where they had to step on the fumier. So they had to step on the fumier every year, and they intentionally built it on that spot as an act of penance, in part. and a memory of their persecution. So it was very meaningful and important for them to build it again on the same spot. Now, this was a bit of a controversial issue because they didn't rebuild it right away, and it became a tourist attraction. And you can see here, it's actually kind of hauntingly beautiful. And this is actually a painting of it by Nagai at Yamada's house. His friend Yamada-san, he painted this there. And many people in the city, particularly the southern part of Nagasaki, wanted to make it like Hiroshima's A-bomb dome. So if you go to Hiroshima, they left one building, the A-bomb dome. And it is a very kind of important tourist attraction. There's all sorts of significance in that it's a reminder of the atrocities of nuclear warfare. And it also is, this is near the epicenter. And they wanted to do the same thing with the cathedral, because look at that. You could see why they would want that. But the Catholics wanted not ruins, they wanted an alive church. And they wanted it on the same spot because of the meaning there. And also, because of their years of persecution and suffering, they had always rebuilt. And the idea of kind of leaving it in ruins was anathema. Like, we're not going to do that. And it was contested. It was a contested thing. But in the end, the Catholics won. They rebuilt the cathedral, and in the same place where it had been before the bomb. And the bell, and this is what it looks like today, and in the right tower, that bell that Nagai and Yamada-san dug up is in the right tower. They replaced it, and it's there today. It rings out today. But I should also point out that even though they did this, it's not as though they erased any memory of the bomb. In fact, you can see here, these are some of the statues from the original cathedral. You can see the destruction of them from the bomb. And you also have inside the cathedral stained glass with images of the ruins. And one of the most amazing artifacts is this statue of Mary, the head of Mary, that was taken away and then given back. And they refer to this as the Hebaka Maria. So Hebaka Shah, victim of the bomb, the Hebaka Maria, and it's in the side chapel. And it's actually very, very beautiful and very important. So there is memory. There is, in fact, at the epicenter, they took one piece of the wall and put it right by the epicenter. They moved it. And standing on top of this is Francis Xavier, a statue of Francis Xavier looking straight toward the epicenter. Again, it's not as though they erased kind of any kind of recognition of the bomb, but they wanted an alive church. And I think that the difference between Hiroshima and Nagasaki is important, and it's represented in the different ways in which they treated these buildings. There's still a saying that people say in Japan today, Ikari no Hiroshima, Inori no Nagasaki. Hiroshima rages, Nagasaki prays. And I think that this has been, that Nagasaki praise is indicative of the narrative put forth by Nagai and by his community. And there really are differences. So one is a kind of attitude that emphasizes peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation, and the other, anger, political protest, and activism. Well, during my last interview in Nagasaki, which was spring of 2023, I interviewed one of the parishioners at the Urakami Cathedral, and he's actually also a direct descendant of Teru Moriuchi, one of the women who went to meet with Father Pettigen in 1865. And at the end of the interview, he recounted that the cathedral, the right tower, has a bell in it, but he told me that left tower, to this day, is empty. They've never put a bell into the left tower. And he suggested that it would be a really good thing if American Catholics gave that bell to Nagasaki. He thought it would be an important message of sorrow and with the hope of forgiveness and reconciliation and peace and the building up of the Catholics here and there. Anyway, so he said it was a good idea, and I immediately thought, well, that sounds like a wonderful idea. And so I wrote to the Archbishop of Nagasaki, Archbishop Nakamura, who I'd already interviewed for my project, and he wrote back to me, and he said this. He said, "Thank you for your kind and heartfelt letter, overflowing with love for God and for us. It is a wonderful Christmas present. We, the Church of Nagasaki, with great gratitude, would like to humbly accept your offer." Again, after talking to this parishioner, I thought this would be great. It would be a way for us to show our admiration, respect, and gratitude for the incredible example of the Urakami Catholics who throughout history have endured unimaginable suffering and yet remain steadfast in the faith. It would be an honor for us to show our solidarity with the Nagasaki Catholics through this gift. And it seems to me providential that it's been left empty all these years that we might have this opportunity. Archbishop Nakamura would like to have it there in time for the 80th anniversary of the bombing, which will be this August 9th. So here are images of the bell that was shattered. So this is the bell. It's in a little museum just to the right of the cathedral. And there's another image of it. On it, you can see the image. This is St. Martin of Tours. It was given by the French. And so there's some Latin here that talks about the French. And then there's some Latin here that we decided to keep on it because it's incredibly important and meaningful. So here is an image of the bell. It was the new bell. It was cast in the Netherlands, and it was just recently, a couple weeks ago, sent to St. Louis. And in St. Louis, they're doing some finishing touches, and in a week or so, it's going to be shipped to Nagasaki. The image here is not St. Martin, but it's St. Kateri Tekakwitha. It's been given from Americans, the first American indigenous state. There's also all sorts of other reasons, and if you're interested, I'm happy to tell you why she makes a lot of sense. But we also kept on some of the original Latin there. And let me read you the English translation of it. It says, "I sing to God with a constant ringing in the place where so many Japanese martyrs with honor have worshipped and have, by their example, called their brothers and sisters and their descendants to the fellowship of the true faith and of heaven." So that's going to remain on that. In my original communication to the Archbishop, I said that we would like to do this, that we would pay for the bell, that we would pay for its transportation, and we would pay for its installation. We didn't want it to cost them anything. The installation is estimated to cost more than I thought it would be. So the total project is $125,000, and thus far we've raised over $70,000. So we're making good progress, and that $70,000 will cover both the bell and the transportation, and even some of the installation. But the installation is the big part that we're still working on. It's going to be done by the MHI, the Mitsubishi Heavy Industry, which is the same company that put in the Wright Tower bell, which is kind of cool. So it has this kind of historical continuity. Speaking of that other bell, let me show you. This is in St. Louis. This is the bell, and I was given this image 3 days ago. So they're polishing it, and so they're still doing it, but this is what it looks like now after it's been polished. So this is before it was polished. This after it's polished, and isn't that beautiful? So that's the bell. They still have stuff to do, and again, within about a week or so, they're going to ship it. They're going to ship it to Nagasaki. Well, the other bell. This is an image of in 1947 when it was, before the cathedral was rebuilt, and it was on this tripod. This is Yamada-san, Nagai's friend, and this is the father of the man who invited me to do this. And the man who invited me to do this remembers his father telling him how beautiful it was when the two bells rang together. And he told me he wants to hear that sound in his lifetime. He also told me he wants the bell to be called the Bell of Hope, which I think is lovely in this Jubilee year of hope. And then he wants the two bells ringing together to be called the Bells of Peace. When I first went to Nagasaki, I wanted to see the original bell. So I asked people, where is it? And they said, well, it's up in the tower. And I said, well, can I go see it? They said, well, no, because it's up in the tower. But in the vestibule of the church, there's an image of it, so I took a picture of it. And it wasn't until I got home that I looked closely, and I saw that on this picture, emblazoned on it, is the image of Christ on the cross. Can you see that? It's right there. And I thought that was remarkable. And I also thought it was utterly fitting, because this is the source of Nagai's joy, his ability to forgive, to advocate for peace, and to help rebuild his church and his city. And it was also the attitude of his fellow Catholics in Nagasaki. For Takashi Nagai, as Paul Glynn writes, the Holocaust of Calvary gave meaning and beauty to the Holocaust of Nagasaki. Thus, a particular theology gave meaning to those who suffered from the bomb, just as it gave meaning to those who for generations suffered years of persecution for their faith. One cannot understand the response in Nagasaki, peace, forgiveness, reconciliation, joyful rebuilding of their church and community, without understanding this Christocentric theology and this unique history. I will close by reading the last lines of one of the versions of the Bells of Nagasaki, one of the songs, which is still sung today, still sung in Japan today. And this is how it goes. And again, it was inspired by Takashi Nagai. I hear the bells of Nagasaki. Is the same night falling as it did then? The insects in the field are asking, no, I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It is the voice of God saying, you can see it reflected on the cross. Thank you. Okay, I'm happy to take some questions if you have any. Yeah.
What bell was the new bell made out of it, and is it the same as the original?
Yes. So it's bronze, same size, same shape, same basic design, and as I showed you, even some of the original Latin is on it. So and that was all intentional. That was all.
It looked awfully silvery.
With its polish, yes, it sure did. Yeah. In fact, my wife liked the before polished version more. Yeah. But it's beautiful. Yeah. Yeah.
If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come over with the mic.
What's the bell made of?
Bronze. Yeah, bronze. It's 750 pounds. It's 66 centimeters by 80 centimeters. With that crown on the top, it makes it about 81 centimeters in height. Yeah. And it's in St. Louis. It was cast in the Netherlands, which is also kind of a cool historical reference point, because during the years of hiding, during the years of Japan's seclusion from the international community, the only port that was open to the west was Nagasaki, and the only country allowed to send a ship into that port was Holland. So that the Netherlands, the bell was cast in the Netherlands. Again, I didn't expect that, but I like that. And it's now in St. Louis, and they're polishing it, they're putting a yoke on it, and so forth, and then they will send it. And the NHK came to the U.S., and they went to the foundry and did a small kind of story on it. And on that program, they rang it for the first time. And so I think that's really cool also that it was a Japanese crew that heard it ring for the first time, and it was broadcast for the first time in Japan. Yeah.
I'm sorry if you told us already that. How did you become part of this project?
So I was working on a book about the doctors on the Manhattan Project. My grandfather was one of them, and his journey was an incredible journey. But part of his journey, I mean, he was in Los Alamos. He mostly delivered babies. He delivered all the babies in Los Alamos. He delivered Oppenheimer's daughter, for example. And he actually also carried the bomb. So he carried the uranium-235 from Los Alamos to Tinian Island, the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. So he was on Tinian Island. But significantly, he was part of a group called the Joint Commission that went into Japan to assess the damage. And so he went into Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was following his journey, doing the research for that book, that I discovered Nagasaki, Nagai, the history of the hidden Christians, and have just been reading and exploring it ever since. So that's how I got into it, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I said, what an incredible story you tell.
Yeah, thank you.
Your research is unbelievable.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so the book I'm working on now is called Remembering Nagasaki, An Enduring Legacy of Suffering and Hope. And I'm about halfway through it. It won't be out for a couple years.
Please let us know when it is. And then what's the name of the book you had up earlier?
That's Atomic Doctors.
Atomic Doctors.
Yeah. That was published in 2020, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Takashi's children, have you been in contact with them? And they're probably your age. How old are his children?
So the two, his son and daughter, both died already, both of cancer, incidentally. But I did interview several times, Tokusaburo Nagai, his grandson, lovely guy, goes to the cathedral. He's he's kind of he takes care of the Nyokodo, as well as next to Nyokodo is a bookstore and museum, and he runs that. And yeah, I also met at a conference on Nagai in Tokyo. I met his brother's grandson, who's not Catholic, but just intrigued by all the interest in Nagai. And he's also a lovely guy, yeah. So I spent some time talking to him. He had some interest in Nagai, but he hadn't really even read him. He was just like a conference on Takashi. He was just intrigued by it, yeah. So, any other questions? Yeah.
I've noticed in some of the images that the old church, the old church and the architecture
Yeah.
had rounded arches, and the new one
Yeah.
had pointed arches.
Yeah.
Is there a significance?
Yeah, good. I don't know exactly. I mean, it's as you could see, there are a lot of similarities. The basic structure is the same, but there are differences.
Yeah, but not everyone builds cathedrals.
Yeah. So the new cathedral, again, it took them a while to get started on it. And at first, it didn't even have the brick. And in anticipation of Pope John Paul II's visit in 1981, they finally put the brick facade on it. So it wasn't actually fully completed until 1981. But it had been completed, I think, in 59. By 1959, I think, is when they completed it after the war. Yeah. But I don't know. It's obviously not quite the same. It's not quite as ornate, but it's still the basic structure and still in the basic, same place. Yeah.
Sure, but in terms of the architecture of the rounded arches and the pointed arches,
Yeah. I don't know. I honestly don't know. That's interesting.
follow-up question, do you happen to know who built the original church?
I don't. No, I don't know who built the original church. There must have been. It's likely there were some help from the French, because the bell was given by the French, and of course they had the real strong influence of the French missionaries who were there at the time. So I'm pretty sure that there was some influence from the French. Yeah.
More of an international.
Yeah, and it's also looks more like a Western European church. Yeah. Yes.
Do you know if is there still a large presence of Catholics in Nagasaki?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that church is still going. It's a very large church. I think there are like 8,000 members, and it's still robust. They have, when we lived there, we would go to Mass there, and they have weekday Masses at 6 in the morning, and there are 70 to 100 people there, which was amazing. But they're struggling, as are we, in terms of numbers and young people staying in, and also Japan is, I'm sure you know, struggling with having kids at all. I mean, there's just declining numbers. And there are declining numbers of vocations. The seminary in Kyushu, the last seminary in Kyushu was recently closed. So they are struggling. They call it the Rokuban. They call it the Yonban Kuzuri, right? And which is a fourth persecution. And some of my interlocutors would call the bomb the Goban Kuzuri, so like the fifth persecution. And one thing I've flirted with is the idea of the Rokuban Kuzuri, meaning the sixth persecution being kind of secularism, modernity, entertainment, distraction, and all of those things. When I ask them the very question that you're asking, they would point to and say, people have too much money. They're distracted by entertainment. There's so much kind of enticing them away from the faith. And some of the people I talked about that, would again kind of say, remember our ancestors, remember what they endured, as a way to kind of encourage the faith today. Yeah. Yes.
You said that, did you say 8,200 Catholics were?
8,500.
8,500
12,000, yeah. For sure. And in fact, it's one of these great ironies that they really, because the bomb was dropped on Urakami, they were disproportionately, the Catholic community was disproportionately affected by the bomb. And another one of my interlocutors, I asked about that, the kind of Hiroshima rages, Nagasaki praise thing, and he said that if the bomb had been dropped on the center of Nagasaki as was intended, so it was about 1.5 miles off target, that it would have been the same as Hiroshima. The reaction would have been the same, characterized by anger and so forth. It was because it was dropped on Urakami that you had this different narrative emerge. And that narrative has been deeply influential, and not only in Nagasaki, but in Japan, and I would say internationally. They're working on the cause for, I have, if you want them, I have the prayer cards for Midori and Takashi. So both of them together, their cause is being advanced by Italians, not by the Japanese. So anyway, suggesting the international influence that he's had. And some of you, I didn't know this, but I don't listen to Hallow app, but evidently right now they're doing a Lenten thing on Nagai based on Paul Glenn's book, A Song for Nagasaki. And I know that because 1 million people have written me and said, hey, did you know that? They're doing this. Oh, is that you?
That's exactly, that's how I know about how they met.
Okay.
Like how they met Midori.
Oh, yeah, Midori, yeah. And isn't it?
We live with them.
Yes, that's right. You live with the Moriyama family, that's right. And isn't it appropriate? Yes, and isn't it appropriate that Midori's cause is going forward as well? Yeah, I think that's really beautiful, that it's not just him, because she was a very strong, lovely, pious person. Yeah.
So the new book you're working on,
Yeah.
does it include these slides, or is this?
Yeah, some of these images
That's
will,
what we will be seeing?
yeah, in the Remembering Nagasaki,
In a
yeah.
few years?
Yeah, in a few
And
years.
how do you get your other book?
What's that?
You said you have one book already.
Well, the Atomic Doctors. Oh, yeah, you can get that, yeah.
How do you get that one?
Well, you can...
There's only 9 left on Amazon.
Oh, you can get it on Amazon. Yeah, it was published with Harvard University Press. You can go to them directly. It is in bookstores, but yeah, you can buy it on Amazon. Yeah. So I just wanted to say one other thing in terms of the kind of historical issues. Some of you may know that Nagasaki was not the intended target on August 9th. It was actually Kokura, but because of cloud cover, the plane circled Kokura 3 times and then went to Nagasaki. And they weren't even sure they were going to be able to drop the bomb on Nagasaki, but at one moment the cloud opens up and the bombardier drops the bomb. That's why it was off target. And I should also point out that the pilot of Boxcar, which is the name of the B-29 that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, was himself Catholic. And also, this kind of this quirky, historical, interesting fact, is that Kokura, if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, you might remember the scene when Leslie Groves wanted to have Kyoto as a target. And it was, on the original target list, it was Kyoto. Because Leslie Groves really wanted Kyoto. He thought it'd be a great way to demonstrate the power of the blast. But it was Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, said, you can't drop it on Kyoto. And in the movie, they have him saying, I went there on my honeymoon. He didn't go there on his honeymoon, but he did go to Kyoto, so he knew Kyoto. And he said, it's an important historical, cultural, and religious place. So he says, so you can't bomb it. Nagasaki, a very important historical, religious, and cultural place. And why it remains on the list is a mystery. I mean, it's really remarkable. And there's a wonderful book called The Apocalypse Factory, which is about Hanford, the Hanford plant which processed the plutonium that was used to drop the bomb. And Steve Olson's the author of that. And he says, no one seemed to be aware of the history of Nagasaki. And I think that was the case. I think they just simply didn't know. They didn't know about it. And also, this is kind of interesting. So Kyoto was originally on the target list. Kyoto is where the 26 martyrs, the first major martyrdom in Nagasaki, in Japan, started. And they marched through Kokura, Hiroshima, and then to Nagasaki. And so you can think of a kind of similar trajectory with the bomb. Kyoto was originally on the target list. Of course, Hiroshima was. Kokura was, and then to Nagasaki. Yeah. Kind of interesting, huh? Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much. It was great being with you. Thank you. Oh, one other thing. I'm sorry. I do have, oh, were you going to do that? I have, if you want to give to the project, because we're still taking donors, there's the QR code. And I also have envelopes if you want to give by check, and also a card with the QR codes. And we would really welcome your participation in this wonderful project. Yeah, thank you. So they're right up here if you want to get those.
There's a limited number of cards and envelopes there, very limited, so if you like them, please go up and get them. Please be generous to the Nagasaki Battle Project, and on behalf of our parish, St. Francis Xavier, Professor Nolan, this is just a small donation from our parish on behalf of our parish.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Domo arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah.